essentially, I'm one of those people you could possibly call a pracademic. I have one foot in academia, but I've often, like Jumoke said, always felt that one of the important things about academia is that you need to be able to translate all the knowledge and all the ideas into practical deliverables on the ground. And for many of us who grew up on university campuses with professors, etc., I think it was very clear that academia itself can cocoon you in a particular ivory tower, so to speak. But if you really want to make impact, you need to step out on the ground, onto the street. So in the past few years, I've worked as a consultant with quite a number of international agencies, United Nations, World Bank, IMF, NEPAD, African Union, advisor to the Blair Commission on Africa. And also, I wear different hats in the media as well. I often work as an African affairs analyst for CNN, BBC, and quite a number of the international news organizations. But 2 years ago, I got a very interesting opportunity to come back to Nigeria to head up the research policy and strategy team for the DFID Governance Assistance Program called Spark. And it's been quite a phenomenal and enriching experience being back home on home soil and, shall I say, contributing my own quota, as we like to say. But like many of us, we want a nimble environment where we can be a bit more effective. So currently, I run my own public policy consultancy firm. And what we really do connects with some of the issues we're dealing with here, which is about how do we begin to leverage internal resources, skills, and expertise within the continent to actually foster our own development. Having said that, I really have to say a very big thank you and congratulate Ini, Emilia, and the organizers of this conference. I think they've done a fantastic job in terms of organizing, but also in helping to raise CSR on the agenda. We all had a very lovely dinner yesterday. Some of my views actually crystallized a bit more after some dancing, some music, and some wine. And I have to commend them also on strategic timing. They decided to host this conference at this very luxurious hotel at the same time as the Lacasera beauty pageant is taking place. And I think it's been a bit more of a conducive environment for a few people to think about CSR issues while beauty queens are walking around. There's a spectacular disadvantage speaking on the last day of a conference. Especially when it's a Friday, it's raining, and particularly when everybody has said almost everything you wanted to say. So I'm tempted to just say thank you very much and go and sit down, but I dare not. I know Ini will not allow me. But let me, in the few moments I have, share a few thoughts and ideas with you about CSR and poverty reduction in Africa. One quick caveat, I am not a CSR expert. I have never worked in the private sector based on an ideological principle. And I had expected that Dr. Teriba was going to speak before me. So I removed a lot of the economic indicators that I put in my presentation because I didn't want to duplicate, and I thought that he will set the context. And hopefully he will arrive before we round up, and he might be able to still do so. So, CSR and poverty reduction in Africa. Where do I point? Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, in 2005, Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, made a very interesting statement when he was starting off his campaign for the Africa Commission. And one of the things he said was that Africa is an open sore on the conscience of the world. Some of us found that grammatically unpalatable. I mean, nobody wants to see their continent as a sore on the conscience of the world. But in many cases, it is true. And as you know, when you have an open sore, you will always have flies to follow. And I think the flies that open the open sore of poverty can, amongst a range of other things, conflict, crime, disease, and other variations of economic and social disruption, retardation, and even stagnation. And it's quite clear. Poverty is bad for business, and we only have to look at some of the things that have happened in the Niger Delta region of Nigeria to realize that if you do not address the issues of poverty in the areas in which you work, the poverty itself will come upon you, so to speak. And quite a number of the companies there are dealing with issues of kidnapping and sabotage and things of that, and crime and sabotage and things of that nature, essentially because the people in those communities feel aggrieved that their resources have been tapped and there's been no essential reward. At the beginning of this millennium, Africa went into it with a great level of optimism. I lived in South Africa for a few years, and I'm sure my South African colleagues will remember President Mbeki's concept of an African Renaissance of sorts. And that really, in many ways, catalyzed a new revival within the continent. We had a transformation of the organization of African Unity into the African Union, and then we had the establishment of the new Partnership for African Development. And at that point in time, everybody was quite excited. This is the African century, it was claimed. This is the century in which we'll be able to leapfrog the challenges of development and walk into development El Dorado, so to speak. A decade or more after, unfortunately, we have not quite gotten there yet, although it must be said that we made significant progress in certain areas. And, you know, one of the things I'm sure many of you have heard in terms of the economic indicators is that Africa is the best place to get good return on investment. Economic growth rates are higher than ever than before. I think Africa is one of the fastest growing economic regions in the world. But at the same time, we still have grinding poverty. And one of the key things perhaps we need to bear in mind is that when we look at these figures that say economic growth rate is 7.8, et cetera, it does not necessarily translate into poverty reduction, because it is one thing for us to have high economic growth rates. It's another thing for us to have distribution of wealth. If anything at all, it is quite possible that you have a high economic growth rate, increasing GDP, so to speak, but a widening gap between the rich and the poor. And what do we end up with? We end up with this. How many people can remember this from yesterday? I thought that while we practitioners and academics can use our grammar and our language to say some things, there's some things that say quite clearly and quite simply. And there we are. We're in a situation where, on a global scale, there's some parts of the world that are much, much richer, and there's some that are much, much poorer. But even within the continent and within our country, we have that gap as well. So the issue arises, how do we tackle the challenge of poverty reduction in Africa and also in Nigeria? It's unfortunate. I studied at the London School for Economics, and two academics from that school have actually put forth some very problematic ideas. One wrote a paper and he suggested that genetically that Africans are not capable of effective cerebral movements, so to speak. Essentially, we can't think about our own problems and we can't find solutions to our own issues. Only recently, I think just last month, another one wrote something that said something about us being unattractive, particularly people of the fair agenda, and it was very controversial. But there are people that do, if they look at the fact that Africa has not developed as fast and as well as many people expected, would be inclined to think that poverty is a natural state. I beg to differ. It's a man-made problem, and it can be solved. I keep thinking to myself, if you can look at the moon and send people to the moon, then I'm sure it's quite easier to solve the challenges of poverty within the continent and in our country. And what are the key challenges we face? Of course, there are myriad challenges that we face, but let me just break them down into poor leadership in the political and business spheres. We've talked about that in certain degrees. Weak institutions that are unable to respond and adapt to the needs of society. I think we've touched on those issues as well in our discussions. Poor political and corporate governance. I think those are some of the issues that Wayne was talking about as well. Lack of proper coordination and resourcing of social programs and weak delivery mechanisms. And on the international scale, we also have an exploitative and unfair international trade regimes. Now, internationally, there has been a recognition of some of these issues, and the global response has been essentially to rally around the Millennium Development Goals. Essentially, I think Emilia gave us some figures earlier on. The Millennium Development Goals are meant to help to halve extreme poverty by 2015. I remember when this started, 2015 looked like a really long time ahead of us. Now it's just 4 years. And from the figures Emilia shared with us about us not even being able to achieve those things in about 100 years, it only not highlights the enormity of the task, but it also clearly highlights the fact that the private sector needs to get a whole lot more involved. Like I said, poverty is bad for business. For the benefit of those, and I doubt if there are any in this room who do not know about the development goals, there are around 8 key clusters. One, to eradicate poverty and hunger, achieve universal primary education, promote gender equality and empower women, reduce child mortality, improve maternal health, combat HIV/AIDS and other diseases, ensure environmental sustainability,